Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ronan Paritsky. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and I'm proud to present Stephen Smith, the CEO of Kitman Labs. He's going to talk about his research on quantifying injury risks.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for showing up. I really appreciate it. I wasn't expecting as many people. So today we're going to be presenting some research and insights around quantifying injury risk. And I think it's a really topical space currently, given that we know injuries are such a huge problem in so many sports. So whilst I'm going to talk about quantifying injury risk, we're not naive enough to think that injuries, and reducing injuries are the most important thing in sports. Winning is the most important thing, but what I want to showcase today is the relationship between injuries and performance and the impact that injuries have on performance. And given that we're an analytics and data science company, what I wanted to do is present some research showcasing exactly how much injuries impact performance. One of the questions we constantly ask ourselves as a company internally is, does sports science even matter? And we've seen teams that have invested hugely in sports science, and for one reason or another, they're either successful or not. And this is a question that we constantly pose to ourselves to understand, does sports science matter? So if what we're trying to do is prevent injuries, what we wanted to do is showcase that there is a relationship, a direct relationship between injuries and performance. And many people have tried to perform research on this previously, and they've failed. And they've failed because what they've tried to correlate with wins and losses is the number of injuries a team has, or the days lost that teams have from injuries, or percentage availability stats. And you can't do that in sports because when you do that, you assume that every single athlete in your team contributes to performance in the same way, and they don't. If an NFL team loses their starting quarterback for 40 days, that is a completely different thing than losing your third-choice quarterback for 40 days. That impacts performance in a completely different way. Potentially, if your third-choice quarterback gets injured for 40 days, nothing changes on the field. So what we did with our research that was very different was that we looked at the relationship between base salary and performance. So we use base salary as a surrogate measure for performance because we believed in a salary cap market, the best talent gets paid the most money. Now, obviously, some guys get paid more than they should, some guys get paid less than they should, but overall, we believe this evens itself out. So we calculated the total spend for every team in the NBA over the last 5 years. We then calculated, retrospectively, the total number of games lost through injury by each team for each player, and we took away a day's worth of salary for each athlete for every day that they missed. So instead of having the total spend for each team, we now had the total amount of money available to actually win, a total amount that was on the court throughout the season. And we correlated that with the number of wins and losses. And we found that the correlation in the NBA was actually 0.76, which is pretty high. In the NFL, it's actually 0.89. It's incredibly strong. And what that shows us is that there is a direct relationship between the amount of money in terms of talent that you have on the field and your ability to win games. What we've also done is we've broken down then the total amount that's spent by each team on injured player salaries. So in the NBA, on average, each team spends $12.9 million on injured players throughout the year. When you break that down further, 63% of those injuries are avoidable through ruptures, strains, and sprains. That accounts for about $8.1 million of potentially avoidable injuries. So if we look at how does that actually impact teams' abilities to win and lose, if you have $46.6 million worth of athlete on the court in the NBA, historically in the Western Conference, you'll get 40 wins. In the Eastern Conference, you'll get 36 wins. But you'll have a 0% chance of getting to the playoffs. If you have $52 million worth of athlete on the court, you'll get 49 wins or 43 wins and 100% chance of getting to the playoffs. So if you can reduce that $8.1 million of potentially avoidable injuries, that has the ability to bring you from a 0% chance to a 100% chance of getting to the playoffs. So when people talk about sports science as a marginal gain or as a one-percenter, we can clearly showcase here that it's not a one-percenter. 9 wins each year in the NBA are solely dictated by health. 20% of the wins needed to get to the playoffs in the NFL or in the NBA are determined by health and health alone. And that is incredible. That's not a one-percenter, it's a 20-percenter. And this research stacks up across every league in the US that we've been able to do this. And you can see for each league, the NFL is 25% of wins. In MLB, it's 9%, in NHL, it's 12%, in MLS, it's 15%. It's a huge deal. And this is the opportunity that sports science has to impact performance. And this is what we can do if we can actually help teams to reduce the injuries that are occurring. So one of the other questions we ask ourselves all the time as well is the data revolution working? Teams are spending more and more money on technology, on analytics, on hardware, on personnel. Injury rates across most of the big leagues globally are rising every single year. The only thing that seems to be getting better over the last number of years is the amount of time lost, the duration of injuries. It looks like sports medicine is getting better. Return to play is getting better. Rehabilitation techniques are getting better. But all of our efforts and all of the money we're spending on prevention is not working. And one of the things we also ask is, well, what's next? Well, what did we see 10 years ago in digital health? Everybody had to have a Fitbit. And then 28 days later, they dropped them and they threw them in the bin. And now companies like that are dying because it cannot get people ingrained in using the product because nobody knows what it means. And that's the exact same thing we're seeing in sport now. People are becoming disillusioned with the data that we have because they cannot create meaning from it. So what we see happening in the industry today is that there is way more data. And that means that there is way more decisions being made. But we don't think that just because there's more data, that better decisions are getting made. And we have data that proves that, and we can showcase actually worse decisions are getting made. And because people are using data incorrectly, we're actually achieving the complete opposite of what we're actually setting out to do. And it's not because people are bad at their jobs or stupid, it's because we haven't given them the tools in the industry to leverage the technology that we've built. This is some data from a professional soccer team that approached us. And they came to us and they said, our coaches are working our athletes way too hard throughout the week in training. And when we get to the weekend, they're too fatigued, they're carrying that into the game, they're breaking. What we want you guys to do is to take that data, run some analysis on it, give us back a report, and help us to educate the coaches as to what optimal training looks like and how we protect our athletes. So we ran the analysis, and we found the complete opposite. And what we actually found was that when they did higher amounts of high-speed running, so you can see anything above 1,350 meters of high-speed running over a 7-day period, they never got injured. But when they backed off from that, they had more and more. And when they did more than 390 efforts of explosive multi-directional work, they had no injuries. But when they did less, they had more and more. And this, we see this time and time again across different teams in different leagues and different sports. And what's amazing here is that in a normal, healthy team, we see these graphs become U-shaped. And they become U-shaped because as you do too much, people start to break again. We never see that profile here because that never happened, because they held their athletes back too much all of the time. It's incredible. And when we spoke with these people and we showed them exactly what was happening, they were dumbfounded by the fact that they were using the information, and they realized that they were compounding the problem because they were holding people back based on the fact that if somebody did more than one standard deviation of change or more than one standard deviation of an increase in high-speed running, they thought that was a risk. Well, it's not a risk. We can showcase clearly that's definitely not. This is an NFL team, exactly the same data. It's two different metrics, high-speed running again, but showcasing exactly the same thing. On decelerations this time, we can see that there's a slight loop up on the right-hand side. But again, it's the complete opposite of what people expect. There's more risk here with doing less than there is with doing more. This is, again, two NFL teams. The first one on the left-hand side is the same one that we saw on the other side, but the one on the right-hand side is from a different team. What's interesting here is that when we analyzed the second team, it wasn't actually the total amount of high-speed running that was important. It looked like they were actually very good at dosing their athletes, but it was actually like the degree of change that actually occurred. And again, it wasn't a degree of change of doing more that hurt people, it was doing less. And it's not always like that. We do see things happening the complete opposite. And this is, you can see the relationship between collisions, and you can see the relationship between accelerations. And you can see here with this, again, NFL team, anything over 200 accelerations over a 7-day period, 33 or 34% of the time, they were getting injured. That's incredible. And all of this data is available, and we can leverage it if we use it right, and we channel the data we're collecting in the right way. Baseball, exactly the same thing. People talk about total arc in baseball and the fact that you need as a pitcher, you need 180 degrees of motion. And if you have a 5-degree change in that motion, that increases your risk by 6 to 7 times. Well, actually, we can showcase that it doesn't. And 5 degrees is not enough, and 5 degrees is not the same for everybody. It's degrees of normal variation for each person, and changes outside of that actually start to break people. And again, we can showcase the exact, and we can quantify exactly how much. On the right-hand side here, you can see hip mobility. most medical research suggesting that hip mobility is related to injuries in pitchers in baseball today suggests that a decrease in hip mobility is directly linked with Tommy John injuries, because a decrease in hip mobility means that they can't wind up as much with their hips. When they try to externally rotate to actually get into a pitching position, they put excessive valgus strain down on their elbow to get that 180 degrees. So it's believed that that actually impacts injuries. We're showcasing it doesn't. Actually, we're seeing the complete opposite. An increase in hip internal rotation was more related with ulnar collateral ligament strain than the opposite. And in fact, a decrease in hip internal rotation didn't matter. What we're finding is that every single team is very, very unique in what this data means. These are 4 teams. These are rugby teams all playing exactly the same league, same level. And we applied some research that's been published on in Australia around acute to chronic ratio and the relationship with that and injury risk. Through this research, they're suggesting that when somebody does more than 150% of what's normal for them, it increases the risk by 6 to 7 times. That red line on those graphs indicates where that research suggests they put it. When we tried to replicate that research through our data sets with these 4 teams that play in the same league, we found that actually at 1.5 was not appropriate for any of them. And why this is dangerous, you can see everybody has their own signature. Why it's dangerous is that if they stopped athletes from training at that level, they're holding them back when they can be gaining more performance. And they can be pushing them harder, and they can be working them harder. They can be getting more gains. They can make people bigger, faster, and stronger, and they're not doing it. And the top team on the left here would have missed 8% of training opportunities. The team on the top right would have missed 13. The team on the bottom left, 15, and the team on the bottom right, 26. That is an enormous amount of opportunities to make athletes better. And we have to be very smart about how we use our data. So what we do that's very, very different is we allow teams to bring in any data source that they want from any area. We put medical records at the very center. So our electronic medical record system sits at the very center of that. And we statistically relate every data point directly back to injuries, so we can showcase exactly what they mean. And we can help people to better understand whether this information means anything or not. Another thing that we do that's very unique, and one of the challenges we ran into very early with this company, was that the majority of teams just don't have a sample size big enough to let you actually build predictive models or strong, robust risk assessment models. The average Premier League soccer team has 23 injuries every year that last 14 days or longer. At best, 8 to 12 of those injuries are actually the same type. If you talk to any statistician or data scientist and you tell them you have 12 samples to build predictive models, they'll laugh at you. So what we do that's very different is that we take all of the data in, we anonymize it and aggregate it, and we look at what happens across all human beings. And then we can split that by sport, and by position, and by team. And we can accelerate the learning, we can speed this up, and we can help teams to leverage the data that they have to get better today. So that means that we are not just an athlete management company, we're not just an electronic medical records company, we're not just a data science company, we're all 3. But that's what's needed to solve this problem. And where we've got to at this point is that we can help teams to do true risk quantification. We can showcase exactly the percentage risk tied to exactly the right type of pathology. We can showcase why that happened, and we're moving towards a world where we can actually help people to forecast and use that data to decrease that risk. So on top of producing back these insights through analytics, we can also help people then to understand, well, where's safe? Where's risk? Where should we be at caution? Where's high risk? And that depends. Each team is different because some teams are willing to carry way more risk because of the makeup of their roster. Some teams are willing to carry more risk on different weeks because of the opposition. And it should change and it should be malleable, but by providing these insights back, you can empower people to make these decisions. And whilst all of those other graphs are horrifically ugly, what we actually do is leverage all of that information back through beautiful software products so people can use this information in real time for decision making. And what happens under the hood and all of the complexity that we showed you, that's all on us. And we do all of that so it can look ugly, but what we give to our clients and what they utilize, very, very simple, very intuitive, very easy ways to actually leverage that data in real time and make better decisions. So in terms of, I'll get to the next slide because it's quite funny, but in terms of where we're moving with this, it's great that we've been able to showcase incredible insights across organizations and showcase which metrics are important, but we all know athletes are different, human beings are different. And what we've learned from having a huge data set is that there are different types of people. So we started to identify different phenotypes of human beings that respond to stresses in different ways. And this allows us now to start to come in and understand, well, what type of person is that? How do we apply the analytics there? And how do we start to get very granular about how we assess risk with each individual person? The person on the left here, when we actually load them and load them too far, they start to break down. But if you actually download, they're fine. The person on the far right, you can throw as much load at them as you want. But if you start to download from them, they start to break down. And the guy in the middle here, if we work him too hard or we download him too much, he breaks. So he has a sweet spot that we need to keep in between. And we're starting to identify these different types of people, and that allows us to build different types of models to actually fit to these so that we can get very specific about what we're doing. So I'm going to get the prize at Sloan this year for the weirdest video ever used at the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, but I promise there's a point to it. So I'll get you to watch it first, and then I'll tell you why it's important and how I can link it back to data.
We're going streaking! Yeah! Woo! Come on! We're streaking! Come on! Come on!
Frank? Frank?
Hey, honey! Hey!
What the hell are you doing?
We're streaking! We're going up through the quad to the gymnasium!
Who's streaking?
There's more coming!
Frank, get in the car.
Everybody's doing it!
So it may seem odd, it may seem random, but when we talk about injury prediction, and we talk about machine learning and AI in injury prevention, everybody's doing it apparently. Every company and every vendor you talk to, they say that. Everybody is doing it. The truth of the matter is, nobody is doing it. And nobody's doing it. Exactly like this scenario. He's out on his own, doing his own thing. And why people aren't doing it, because it's not as simple as just getting your data and throwing it into Watson and doing something like that. It's an incredibly complex question that we're asking. And we have to understand how injuries occur to even be able to start and to ask those questions correctly. So why it's important, the amount of different pieces that come into asking a very strong question about injury risk is huge. The pathology of injury, we can't just say we're solving all injuries. That's not the way it works. How a ligament sprain happens is completely different to how an ankle fracture or how a rotator cuff strain occurs. So being able to identify the exact pathology, the code of that pathology and the exact injury, is incredibly important to ask a very strong question to get the right answer. Asking questions over the right timeline, if you look at data from preseason and in-season together, it's confusing because completely different things happen at different times. Looking at practice injuries versus game injuries, we had no idea when we started doing our research on this. We used to throw everything together and see what would happen. What we realized was that per exposure, game injuries happen at an infinitely higher rate than training injuries, which means that if you bundle them together from a risk perspective, you get an inflated index when you're looking at what's happening in practice, and you get a deflated index when you're looking at what's happening in games. And that's really important because if you think that somebody's walking out onto the field in practice and they have 15% risk and they really have one, that's a completely different thing. So being able to understand the question and having that granularity is incredibly important. Likewise, the mechanism. If you're looking to try and solve hamstring injuries and we ping our database and we ask that question and we don't put in the mechanism, we're trying to solve a problem for you and all of your injuries are happening through the accelerated phase for hamstring injuries and we ask everything, well, maybe all the injuries we've asked are all about deceleration. So we get a completely different answer and we give you the wrong insights. Asking the right question is incredibly important, and this is not as simple as people want to suggest it is. It's incredibly hard. And all these other vendors and people that are saying that they're doing it, unless they can show you the insights, unless they can ask the question right, they simply cannot do this. And one of the things that we wanted to hammer home is that everybody can do this. Everybody that's here is collecting data of some kind with the teams and organizations that they work with. People have been collecting data for years now. Everybody can do this. They just need the right vehicle to make it happen. And what we've been doing is helping teams to take all of the historical data that they have, take that, run analysis on that, provide them back reports, help them understand what the information means, drive that back down to our software tools, and then help them to better leverage the data that they're collecting today, help them to make better performance-led decisions. And then every year we review that. We produce reports to understand what's changed. Because human beings change, the stress has changed, the games change, the style that we play changes. So we continuously need to refine what we're actually doing and understand which metrics are telling us a strong story, which ones are solving the problems that we have, which ones are not. How do we move forward from there? Which ones do we throw out and which ones do we refine? Because we don't believe that collecting 100 variables and then trying to actually manage that day-to-day is smart. We believe in core pillars of data that tell you strong stories that help you to solve the problems that you're having every single day. So I've been working on this for over 10 years in professional sport. As an organization, we've been doing this for more than 4 years. We published our first annual injury assessment report last year and showcased that we helped teams to reduce days lost to injury by 42%. We are the proven global leader in this space, which as an Irish person, would generally not the nicest thing to say, because we're really a very, very humble race. But we are, because there's nobody else that is linking the data that's being collected back to actual injury events. Nobody's doing it, so how can they know the problem that they're solving if they actually haven't got the problem in their grasp? 2 years ago, when I moved to the US, we were working across 2 different leagues. Today, we're working across 25 different leagues on 5 continents. And we want to continue to grow this. We want to continue to help teams. We want to continue to drive the changes in this industry that we think is needed. And we want leagues to adopt approaches like this because they need to, because they have to protect their athletes. And we want them to improve the games. And right back to what we saw at the start, there's a massive link between this information and performance. There's a massive link between this information and wins. And that means there's a massive link between this information and the product that these leagues are putting out. And that affects everything. That affects fans, that affects revenue, that affects ticket receipts, that affects merchandising. So I hope that I've given you some insights into who we are, what we do, and how we can move forward within this industry to quantify injury risk. Thank you.